Hi, I'm getting ready to shorten the sleeve on this wedding dress and to tighten the cuff. I hope you'll join me. Hi, I'm Carrie. Thanks for joining me today here on So Darn Fun. If you're new to this channel, I want to give you a great big welcome. Be sure and check out my formals playlist where you'll find some other useful alterations for formal dresses, and I've got some other playlists you might be interested in checking out. With bridal season approaching, you just might find yourself in need of knowing some of the aspects of this alteration. So let's head on over to the ironing board and get to it. First, let's talk about what needs to be done to this sleeve and how we are going to accomplish that. The main thing here is that the sleeve needs to be shortened, and I accomplish that by taking the cuff off and actually moving it up to the level that it needs to be at. And in this case, it needs to be shortened 2.5 inches, which is just above this third button here, which is just about perfect. So what I'm going to do is take off the cuff, move it up. I'm going to take off these 3 buttons and I'm going to sew them up here. The vent will not be extended, so the 3 buttons will actually be kind of like faux, just for looks. But the main thing we have to consider when we move this cuff up is that the cuff is too big by 2 inches, so we need to reduce the circumference of this cuff. Now, look at this. On this side there's loops. On this side there's buttons. I think it's going to be easier to replace the buttons than the loops. So I'm going to take the cuff off, shorten it on the button side, and then re-put the buttons back on. So the first plan of attack is to pick out the stitching. Then we can alter the cuff and then move it up. So let's unbutton some of these buttons here. Give us a little bit of room to play with. Oh, these are stretchy loops. Nice. Okay, so then it's easy to take them off. Okay. I like to use a regular seam ripper. Some people don't. This is my preferred method. We'll just fast forward through all this since it's not very exciting as we pluck out stitches. All right, here's the sleeve with the cuff taken off. You can see right here that it has one thread that has gathered all of that. And we will need to cut off 3 inches. They have a 1/2 inch seam allowance down here. So I want to cut this flat. I'm going to break that thread by just pulling here. So now I know when I press this out, it's going to be flat and I can cut it on a flat piece rather than on a gathered piece of fabric, which might give me an uneven edge, which I don't want. So I'm going to lay this double layered here with the vent on this side up here and then just a fold on the lower edge here, lower edge of the camera. I like to use this gridded ruler. It's just so handy. Now these buttons, let's move the buttons too so that I can lay it flat. So let's just quickly pop these off here. Don't lose them because I'm going to be putting them back on again. And then I can get rid of this pin, which was my marker for what level I needed to bring that cuff up to. All right, because my cuff needs to be 2.5 inches above where it was, and it had a 1/2 inch seam allowance here on the edge. Really what I need to do is just go ahead and draw 2.5 inches above the raw edge, and we will be exactly where we need to be for a new seam allowance and to apply the cuff again. Okay, there's my rough line there. If you haven't used these friction pens, you're missing out because they disappear with heat. Now the problem is they do reappear again in cold weather. So unless you're planning on getting married in an ice box, you'll probably be just fine. So I'm going to cut this on this line right here. Actually right through that button loop. There we go. Now when we put this cuff back on with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, we're going to be just at the level we need to be at. But we can't do that yet because the cuff is too wide. Remember, we've got to take it in 2 inches. Let's pop off the rest of those buttons. Oh, that went on the floor. Now we can take this, turn it inside out. I'm going to give this a press too, and then we'll be able to figure out our line for our new stitching. Okay, this cuff needs to be tightened 2 inches, so what we're going to do is take 2 inches off of the width. And so for this one, because I just need a stitching line to measure from the old stitching line, and I'm just going to mark a new stitching line. I don't need to worry about seam allowance. I'm just going to stitch here and then trim it off here. I'm going to take this to the machine and stitch it, and then I will be right back. Okay, here it is, stitched. Stitched on that red line. Let's press that line away just for fun. Ta-da! Love that. And then let's trim it. All right. By the way, if you want to know where you can get these friction pens, I have a link in my description below, and my links are associate links, so if you do make a purchase from it, I receive a small commission from that, but I'm sure you can find them at your office supply store. So let's turn that right side out. Give that a good press too. This is going to be our new cuff width. And because this cuff is sewn on in one fell swoop, sandwiching the sleeve and then just top stitch on through all layers, we're going to go ahead and fold in that corner. Fold in that seam allowance. And I've got all these messy threads here. I'm going to need to pull all these out. That's what I hate about seam ripping. When you can't just slide the threads out, it leaves all these little whiskery threads. Okay, I think I got it. All right, let's look at our sleeve now. Here's our sleeve, and we need to stitch a basting line. I'm going to do a basting line a little bit less than ½ an inch from this edge, and I'll be right back. All right, we're back again. I've got that basting stitch right there. When I baste something like this for gathering, I do like to tie to the ends in a knot. That way they don't slide out when I pull them. So I'm going to pull from the other end and make some nice gathers. I just want to make sure that the gathers don't all pool at the end and get too voluminous where I tied that knot. Try to make the gathers even. And they look pretty even. I'm going to take my cuff here, making sure that I have the right portions. See, I've got the loops on this side. I need to make sure that when I put the cuff on, the loops are on the same side, obviously. So I think I'm going to just start pinning this on, and then I'm going to even out the gathers as I go. First I'll do one end, then the other. Trying to wrap those ends really tightly so that the cuff doesn't stick out too far off of the edge of that vent there. Kind of comparing where I have the middle of the sleeve as well as the cuff. I'm going to just pin one side and then match up the inside of the cuff to the same area. Okay, so I think I've got this cuff plastered on pretty well with all these pins, and now we'll take it to the sewing machine and top stitch that on. So this cuff doesn't fit around my free arm, so I'm gonna have to kind of inch it along a little bit. Plus this button is also kind of in the way of my presser foot, so I've moved my needle over to the left a little bit so I can access where I need to sew. So I've got my needle in the fabric, and I'm going to start to sew. I'm trying to make sure that the cuff on the bottom side is going to be included when my needle is sewing. I want to get all layers. If I don't get all layers, I'll just have to go over those spots twice. Looks like I caught it, except for this first portion here. So I'm going to go over this first portion again, folding it enough to the inside. There's our cuff. Let's give it a little press. There we are, and now all we need to do is sew on those 3 buttons. So I'll mark those placements. Okay, so we probably need to be more like that. And then after I get those sewn on, I'm just gonna replace the ones up here above the vent. Let me get those sewn on and then I will come back and show you, and we'll be done with this sleeve and cuff. All right, here's my sleeve completed, and I just want to show you a little detail that I did that I think is going to work really well. Now we can see that this is a sheer sleeve, and we can see this folded over placket here, which makes a darker white against the outer fabric. And we know that we had to sew 3 buttons up here that are actually not useful. This is a real vent here, you can see, but up here there's no vent. And because of that, if I was just to lay those buttons on the fabric, it would be a button just with sheer fabric and nothing else. When I cut off the end of the sleeve to shorten it, there was a bit of this kind of folded back placket that I used. Can you see? I just laid it underneath those 3 buttons. Not only does it provide some stability and something for me to actually sew the buttons onto rather than this one layer of sheer fabric, it provides a foundation for those buttons. It also makes a darker padding behind it so it looks like placket, but it's really not. So I'm really happy with how that turned out. So here's our sleeve. That was probably a lot easier than you'd thought. And what fun it is to be able to make these alterations and get the kind of results that we're hoping for. Here's a quick shot of that sleeve on the dress, and I might say that the bride was extremely happy. And that's all there is to it. Now you can shorten Bishop's sleeves. Be sure to check out my playlist on formal dress alterations. There might be something useful there that you could use. If you have any questions, please drop them in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on So Darn Fun.